Hello and welcome. My name is Al Barrows, and this is UFO Disclosure, the podcast that's meant to show an average person's reaction to all the UFO, UAP news from everywhere and anywhere. Today, I'd like to relate something that I saw on Megalithic Marvels. It involves a UFO that crashed in Kingman, Arizona in 1953, yet remained covered up for decades. The earliest reference of a crash near Kingman, Arizona had been made to MUFON researcher Richard Hall in April 1964. The case of the Kingman UFO retrieval was then brought to the public attention by a guy named Raymond Fowler, who was known as a respected UFO researcher in June of 1973. That's when he started to write about it. Fowler stated that his information came from the engineer named Arthur G. Stansel. Stansel signed a legal affidavit vouching to the honesty of his testimony, which was released by Raymond Fowler in the UFO magazine April 1976. Now, this engineer, Arthur G. Stansel, was employed by Air Materiel Command at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. Stansel was a mechanical engineer testing Air Force aircraft engines. Stansel was also working for the Atomic Energy Commission and was designated as a project engineer on some of the atomic bomb tests referred to as Operation Upshot, Not Whole. These tests were located on the southern end of the Nevada test site. And on May the 21st, 1953, Stansel was called away by his boss on special assignment at the Indian Springs Air Force Base, where he joined about 15 other specialists. They were flown by military plane to Phoenix, where they boarded a bus with blacked out windows and rode for an estimated 4 hours. When they arrived at their destination, somewhere southeast of Kingman, Arizona, they were met and briefed by an Air Force colonel who told them they were to investigate the crash of a super secret test vehicle. Stansel and the others on the bus were told not to speak to each other under any circumstances. Stansel's job was to determine the forward and vertical velocities of the vehicle when it impacted in the sand. Stansel was then escorted to the site by military police. Stansel stated that as he approached the site, there were these two military arc lights illuminating the saucer that was embedded into the sand. He said it was approximately 30 feet in diameter and about 14 feet tall. The saucer was embedded in the sand about 20 inches, and after making measurements and later studying the crash site, Stansel concluded that the craft had struck the ground at approximately 1,200 miles per hour. Stansel described the craft as being constructed of this dull silver-like metal. It had a series of slots going around the outer circumference of the disk. And the scientists were told that the material the craft was made of was classified. Apparently, the craft featured a curved entry hatch, but it had no hinges whatsoever. When they opened the hatch, they saw inside an oval interior cabin with 2 swivel seats and many instruments. Now, this is where the story gets interesting. So Stansel and the others corroborated that they saw at least one body at the crash site, but they never really used the word extraterrestrial. Instead, they used the word humanoid and said that it was about 4 feet tall with brownish skin, wearing a silver metallic-like flight suit. He actually saw it in a tent near the crash site. Here's written testimony from Arthur Stansel, found by Derek Olson, that was written for Raymond Fowler, which he later published. And it states, quote, "I, Arthur Stansel, do solemnly swear that during a special assignment with the U.S. Air Force on May the 21st, 1953, I assisted in the investigation of a crashed unknown object in the vicinity of Kingman, Arizona. The object was constructed of an unfamiliar metal which resembled brushed aluminum. it had impacted 20 inches into the sand without any sign of structural damage. It was oval and about 30 meters in diameter. An entranceway hatch had been vertically lowered and opened. It was almost 3.5 feet high and 1.5 feet wide. I believe he's describing the hatch only here. He continues, and I quote, I was able to speak to someone on the team who did look inside. He saw 2 swivel seats, an oval cabin, and lots of instruments and displays. He also noticed a medical tent pitched near the craft. It held the remains of the pilot. He was about 4 feet tall. It had a dark brown complexion and had 2 eyes, 2 nostrils, 2 ears, and a small round mouth. It was clothed in a silvery metallic suit and wore a skull cap of the same type of material. It wore no face covering or helmet. He certified that the above statement was true by affixing his signature to the document on June the 7th, 1973. And then much later, in 1977, author and UFO researcher Leonard Stringfield received a supporting document from a National Guard member working at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The witness described a 1953 delivery from an Arizona crash site involving 3 bodies, each about 4 feet tall, with large heads and brownish skin, packed in dry ice. Stringfield believed that this report referred to the very same Kingman Ufo crash, and that instead of 1, there were actually 3 extraterrestrials. Now, the scientists were only allowed to stay on the site for about 1 hour as a group, and then they were quickly loaded back onto the bus and left. Back on the bus, all the members apparently were made to sign non-disclosure agreements, or what was back then called the Official Secrets Act. And in a hurry to clear the crash site, the Army Corps of Engineers brought in an M25 tank transporter with a long 18-wheeler tractor trailer behind it. They built this large wooden cradle and then propped up the craft onto it. They quickly headed toward the Hoover Dam, where they then strung a huge cable across the Colorado River. They then brought a barge down the river and attempted to drive the tank transporter onto the barge. But as the transport started to cross the river, the cable snapped, and at one point, the outer wall of the disc actually hits the Hoover Dam. And eventually, they somehow found another way to cross the river. According to researcher Harry Drew, they eventually bring the craft to a remote operating facility at Groom Lake. So this researcher, Harry Drew, interviewed Colonel Wendell Stevens, who was actually part of the crash retrieval. And Wendell Stevens described to Harry Drew that he saw at the crash site a pyramidal-looking rock outcropping. I think he was describing a natural rock outcropping, the kind that just went up in a pyramid shape. And he says he saw this in 1953. According to Harry Drew, he later went to the site and claims that he literally found this pyramidal-looking rock outcropping, which was proof to him that Colonel Wendell Stevens was telling the truth and that he was actually at the operation, at the crash retrieval. So there are actually declassified emails from 2020 that seem to validate the UFO Kingman crash. These emails were between Christopher Mellon and some other official. Christopher Mellon is an American former Department of Defense and United States civilian staff member whose career from 1985 to 2017 focused on defense and intelligence oversight. He's also an advocate for transparency in government investigations of UFOs. And I'm literally going to read to you from these screenshots of these emails. Again, these were declassified. Some of them still have redactions, but they're talking about it. It appears they're talking about the Kingman, Arizona crash, which, if these emails are true, this again just brings even more validity to the story. At the top, it's redacted, and then it says blank and I are making huge progress getting into the crash retrieval program. He plans to meet with you at some point. Then the next statement says the blank would be slack-jawed if they found out what we know, end quote. Okay, so these statements were made by the senior U.S. official, and Christopher Mellon replies, it's all redacted. And then the senior U.S. official replies to him and says this, quote, right now, we haven't gone that far back. We're dealing with the recovered UAP that landed in Kingman, Arizona in the 50s. We're vacuuming up information as blank gets read in. We now know the management structure and security control systems and ownership of CR. We also know who recovers landed or crashed UAPs under what authorities. By the way, they say CR. I believe that means crash retrievals. We also know that a still highly classified memo by a Secretary of the United States Air Force in the 1950s is still in effect to maintain the cover on UAPs. This conversation occurred in 2020. So the Kingman UFO crash was first uncovered when UFO researcher Raymond Fowler published details about it given to him by scientist Arthur Stansel, who claimed to have worked at the crash site. Yet to this day, very few people know about it outside of UFO circles. And within those UFO circles, it still remains a hotly debated event. Yet, I still think it's worth looking into, and I still think it's worth letting the general public know about it. My name is Al Barrows. This has been UFO Disclosure. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.